Hi, my name is Barzey, CEO of ADB Medical. Thank you for tuning into my talk. This talk is about orphan drugs and global regulatory strategies. A major part of it is to aid a company in planning globally the launch, development and flow of their long-term treatment options for rare disease. Now, I'm going to talk about global orphan drug regulatory strategy. The first time that I had dealings with orphan drugs was for onafinimab, which is a monoclonal antibody for GSK. And we helped to create a regulatory strategy from the start when you're thinking about EU, FDA, and other markets, because as they're a large company, they like to think about the whole plan from the get-go, which is a brilliant idea, by the way. First of all, orphan drug legislation. Now, orphan drug legislation was originally introduced by the FDA through the Orphan Drug Act in 1983, which is a long time ago for some of us. And since then, many other countries have followed suit. I think there's about 27 countries at the moment which have some form of orphan drug legislation. So, global orphan drug regulatory strategy. Why? Well, first of all, you need to think about your product, the clinical trials, how much is the investment's going to cost, when you're going to get your investment back, and how fast you're going to be able to get it out into the market. And by having a solid global regulatory strategy, which especially for orphan drugs, as I've said before, legislation is in some countries, but not, you need to be able to map them out, to have a target plan so you can allocate your resources effectively, you can please your shareholders and your stakeholders, and also you need to be able to know where you're going to find the patients from. Because with orphan drugs, you often find that recruitment for clinical trials with patients is difficult because you have such a small amount of them sprinkled around the world. Here are three of the top markets for orphan drug designation. So you've got the USA, European Union and Japan. Now, the USA is considered the leader in orphan drug designation. The majority of applications for orphan drug designation go to the FDA first. This is from a report in 2015 from the Orphan Drugs and Rare Disease Research Unit. The European Union, they did follow suit later. They weren't the second one to do that. They did follow later, but for me, they are the leaders in collaboration with other agencies. So they do collaborations with the TGA of Australia. They do collaborations with the FDA. They do collaborations with Japan, and they also encourage you to reach out to other health authorities at the same time. Japan has the best healthcare for orphan drugs to do with safety and efficacy, because their regulations state have quite stringent safety and efficacy guidelines for orphan drugs, and they do request a lot of data. I personally experienced them asking for things that some blood results I hadn't even heard of. Australia, South Korea and Taiwan. So Australia, the TGA is working in collaboration with the EMA, and someone who was previously presenting did state that the EMA and Australia do share with each other during the approval process. And that kind of harmonisation is supposed to speed up the process of a drug getting approved. It's also supposed to minimise questions. I don't know how many people over here have been through a regulatory process to have a drug approved, but what happens is you do your clinical trials, you produce the package, you try to predict the questions that the health authority is going to ask, you submit it to them, and then they come back with questions that you didn't think of, and then you need to go and get an expert, and so on. Now, the reason why questions are reported in the regulatory process is because time costs money, 1. 2, the longer your drug is not out on the market means that a patient who doesn't have any alternative doesn't have an appropriate therapy. So those are the two things. By them harmonising and making sure that they're not both asking the same questions and they're picking out the same things, you get more of a streamlined process. I haven't seen any results so far from a study of accelerated or fast-track approvals on those two markets yet, because it's relatively new. Taiwan is the leader in Asia when it comes down to orphan drugs. China and some of the other markets do not have orphan drug legislation. South Korea, on the other hand, also has orphan drug legislation. Let's go into the FDA. So with the FDA, the Office of Orphan Product Development acts on the behalf of the FDA. So what you find with markets, I say markets because if you say countries, the EU is not a country, it's a market, tend to have their own specific group to deal with orphan drug designation. So the FDA created the OOPD to act on their behalf, to work with investors and organizations to improve rare disease treatments. And that started in 1983, as I said before. And more than 500 drugs and biological products for rare disease have been approved in the US since. So that's a big change from before then, because as you can understand, there wasn't much of a desire to spend so much money into investment for a product which is going to be treating 1 in 10,000 patients. You wouldn't get your investment back and you still have to pay the fees and so on. Now, when the FDA introduced this, the financial incentives is 50% tax credits, which when you look at pricing, which someone else is going to talk on later on, that's a lot of money. The FDA fee is waived. Last time I worked with a company, they were submitting for an opioid treatment, and it was 1.23 million they had to pay for the whole process of applying and then reapplying after those issues and so on. So those fees, those waivers of the fees and the grants to help you set up your clinical trials, to recruit patients and so on, are a vital incentive for patients to get new treatments for their rare disease. Market exclusivity is 7 years, and one of the more important ones is the breakthrough status. Now, breakthrough status you get in the US means that it'll be fast-tracked, you'll be looked at, reviewed faster. It's not just orphan drugs which get breakthrough status though. Now, the requirements are that you must have less than 200,000, and the nature of the target disease must be rare. European Union via the EMA. The major thing with the EMA though is the scientific advice which you can get. Also the fact that they work alongside other agencies like the FDA or the EMA. The EMA has the Committee for Orphan Drug Medicinal Products, and that's the group that you need to approach early on to see if you can get orphan drug designation. The requirements for orphan drug designation are different to the US. It must be life-threatening or chronically debilitating. Now that's something which is in the requirements, which is not in other markets, which is something you need to put in your strategy. So if you had a disease which was rare, but it's not life-threatening, and it's not chronically debilitating, then obviously in your strategy you're not really going to push forward with the EMA, and there must be no alternative treatment. This is the EMA's flowchart that they provide to you to help you make those kinds of decisions. Australia, the TGA, doesn't provide a fast-track acceleration review, but it can be done alongside the EMA. So they do share the assessment reports, so that can create harmonization with your product launches, with your resources for clinical, pharmacovigilance, regulatory, and having harmonization across departments is very cost effective and time effective, because people have to answer the same questions and stay on the same product rather than dealing with one country now and another one later on. You find that it gets done a lot more efficiently. There is no market exclusivity from orphan drug designation in Australia at this point in time. You get fee reductions and reimbursement under Australia's life-saving drug program. Prevalence is less than 2,000. This slide is about the joint FDA-EMA application form. This was introduced a couple of years ago, and the idea was so that if a marketing authorization holder or somebody who wants to be marketing authorization holder has decided that they will meet the requirements for the EMA and the FDA, they meet the requirements for the FDA, they can submit a form and have harmonization with the EMA and FDA. Previously, before this initiative, you would have had to send a summary report, an annual summary report to the FDA, a different one to the FDA. It wouldn't necessarily be on the same dates, and it would take a lot of time. It would be difficult to, it was more difficult to maintain, and to encourage companies to apply to both EMA and FDA, because there was a lot of markets which would apply to the FDA but not the EMA. So to encourage the EMA to receive more applications for orphan drugs, the initiative was of combining the FDA and EMA application form. Here's the form. Japan, the PMDA. Japan was the second country to introduce legislation to rare disease. They did this in 1985. To qualify for orphan drug designation, you need to apply to their Orphan Medicinal Products Committee. Japanese requirements have a prevalence less than 50,000, so that's 4 per 10,000. Be rare and medically serious. There must be no other treatment, and expected efficacy and safety of the drug must be excellent in comparison to other drugs available. Now, that is very broad. It's very difficult to understand that. And what I've personally felt is that when we've had a strategy of applying to the FDA and EMA, it was also because there's a significant financial incentive in Japan, the application incentive to Japan as well, and a lot more resources for regulatory and medical and PV to answer the questions is diverted to Japan around the time you expect their questions. But this is normally done in a Japanese office because they accept the report in Japanese, and it's very hard to find someone in London who is medically trained and can write in Japanese. I know a company that have been looking for someone to help them do this for about 6 months to find someone who's medically trained but is also fluent in Japanese. So a lot of the time you have to get a CRO or a smaller company in Japan to directly deal with the PMDA, which is something you need to put into your regulatory plan as well. Taiwan. February the 9th, year 2000, Taiwan's legislative yuan implemented the Rare Disease and Orphan Drug Act to improve the diagnosis, treatment, and access to medicines for patients with rare disease. Now, their requirements are less than the other ones that I've previously mentioned, so it must be rare as per the TFRD's definition. So you do need to say that this rare disease, this is the indication we're targeting, and it must have a prevalence of less than 1 per 10,000 in Taiwan. They give you a priority review and regulatory assistance. They also give 10 years, possible 2 years extension. They give grants as well, just like with the FDA. They give fee reductions, and if it's already approved by the FDA, you do not require further clinical trials for specific patients in Asia. Some markets, like Mexico and Egypt, will review a new product on an accelerated review process if it is improved by USPI or a centralized EU SMPC. For example, ofatumumab was approved at a fast track in Mexico because we had the regulatory package and we provided the EU centralized SMPC because it's important that it was centralized. They wouldn't take a national one. The thing with Mexico was that it wasn't really written down. This was something which had been agreed directly with the health authority by the local affiliate in Mexico. Further reading, I've provided the links for parts of the slide deck. And also, Orphanet is a very good place to go where you can go and find further information on orphan drugs and orphan diseases. Thank you. Any questions?
One question. What you've observed in Japan and in other countries where they are more stringent, does that lead to fewer approvals?
I have been in one company, a multi-billion company, where we've had the decision for a week where we've discussed whether we were going to continue pushing through with the license for this product because the workload that was given, the in-depth request for new clinical data was far beyond what we'd expected, and it was taking an impact on the budget. So the actual product hadn't been licensed in Europe yet. It had been just had FDA approval. So the idea was that maybe we would take a step back and wait for a further decision from higher up to see if we would pull the drug. That was something they were toying with, but in the end, they spent a considerable amount of money doing a post-marketing survey, post-marketing study, and they also added that to the EU SPC. So Europe ended up getting the data which was requested by Japan. So sometimes, because of Japanese requests for further information to meet their efficacy and safety, you do have to provide further information, and it is ethical to spread that around and provide it to other health authorities, especially at the fact that they do communicate with each other anyway. So we investigated. It was all to do with blood counts, basically, because it was for chronic lymphatic leukemia. So it's to do with blood counts. So we investigated further the blood counts in the existing clinical study report, pulled some comparative information from other disease treatments, and submitted it to the PMDA, who accepted it, and then we submitted an update through clinical overview to the EMA and the FDA. The FDA said they weren't interested, but the EMA did include it into section 5.1, 5.2 of their SBC.
But overall, do you know if fewer drugs are approved in Japan?
Fewer drugs are...
Very
All right, I'm trying to think. I've got the... Last time I had a look at that, it was 2013, and there was less in Europe than it was in Japan. But then there was less applications. Percentage-wise, yes. Percentage-wise in Japan is less. There's less applications. But in Europe Europe is more stringent in the requirements for an orphan drug, as in the life-threatening thing is the issue I find with companies more than the questions.
So the situation you just described, by applying to Japan, did that slow down the approval in Europe, or was that
No.
all goes
No, because of the centralised procedures mechanism, it didn't slow it down. And that is a good question. I'm unsure that if in Australia, TGA has a question and you're already in a centralised procedure, and as they do work sharing, if that would slow it down. I would like to believe that the fact that they put these harmonisations in place, it was to smooth things out, not to slow things down. But no, it didn't slow down the centralised procedure process, but it did cause a lot of people in departments lots of stress and increased working hours, which is something you need to take into account.